Hi, Frank,
Okay.
and welcome to all of our audience. It's wonderful to have so many different businesses represented today and a global audience as well. So welcome everyone wherever you are. I'd like to start by doing a brief introduction before handing over to our expert guest speaker, Frank Douglas, today. My name is Gemma Soul, and I work at the School for CEOs. We are experts in executive education, and we work with a wide range of businesses, both UK and internationally, to support their senior leaders. Our leadership interventions range from 24-hour courses, workshops, right through to nine-month consolidated leadership programs. And we also support individuals through individual one-to-one executive coaching. Now, I have two roles at the school. The first is as part of the coaching panel, where I'm an executive coach. And I also am the digital and client engagement director for the school. So my role today is to ensure that you all have a great experience and to make sure that everything runs smoothly. So this is going to be a really interactive presentation with Frank. There'll be opportunity to participate in polls, opportunity to ask questions throughout. And I know, Frank, you're going to be making some pauses during the presentation to take questions. So we encourage you to indulge your curiosity and ask as many questions as you wish. And the best way to do that is if you wiggle your mouse just now, you should see along the bottom of your screen a Q&A box. So if you click on that Q&A box, you should have an opportunity to ask questions, and those will come directly to me. So I will endeavour to ask as many of your questions, pose as many of those questions to Frank as I can in the next 45 minutes. So today's theme is about becoming an inclusive leader in a global context. And it's a real privilege to have Dr. Frank Douglas as our expert guest speaker here today. I know that Frank's going to tell you a little bit about himself, so by way of brief introduction, Frank is an experienced HR director who's been recognised as one of the UK's most influential directors. And following the setup of Kairos Executive, where he's CEO, he was also recognised as one of the movers and shakers in the HR consultancy field. He'll tell you a little bit more about Kairos shortly, but he's also served on the board of the CIPD, and in 2017 he was awarded an honorary PhD by Middlesex University for his services to the human resources profession, and also for his advocacy for diversity and inclusion. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you all over to Frank. Welcome.
Thank you, Gemma, and thanks to everyone on the call today. Not sure I can live up to that billing, but I will try my best. A little bit about my firm first, and we're a strategic advisory firm. We focus on culture, leadership, and inclusion. Our clients range across all sectors in broadcasting, from the BBC and Viacom to technology, Bloomberg, professional services with Hogan Lovells, banking with UBS, and in the creative spaces, MNC Saatchi, and even in the charity space with the Scouts. And we've worked across the pretty much most major continents. So that's the paid advertisement there. A little bit about me. I'm sure the accent gives it away a little bit, but I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, which is then and now still the poorest state in the US, lowest per capita. Raised in the South Bronx of New York City. It's a step up in some ways. It was probably the highest crime rate and a hotbed for gang activity. And I've lived in Europe for the last 20 years. And during that time, I've lived and worked in London, The Hague, Belfast, and Edinburgh. Don't ask me which one is my favorite city, but I like them all. And I've been responsible for global teams across the globe. And indeed, inclusion for me is not just a business, it's a way of living, given the rather multicultural nature of my household. So the question, I guess, as we get into this, is why is diversity and inclusion a business imperative? And I'll quote from the Deloitte work that's been done, but a host of reasons why, and you're feeling it, I'm sure, every day in your business. Things are changing. So the diversity of markets. In fact, by 2025, the world's middle class population is expected to be 3.2 billion, up from 1.8 billion. And the majority of that growth will be coming from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And clearly, I'm sure, as many of you have seen, the markets and demand is shifting. The diversity of customers, customer demographics are changing. There's a little fact I have that my wife is always puzzled that, this is the one I quote and why am I aware of this, but the Perler, which is high in lifestyle, as they like to call themselves. We probably know them more as lingerie for women, but they're now a lifestyle brand with pocketbooks. But up until 2 years ago, their biggest store in the world was not in New York or London or Paris. It was actually in Dubai. And currently, their biggest store now is in Hong Kong, with Hong Kong and Dubai being their two biggest shops. Again, like I said, my wife always wonders why it is I'm on top of a Perler's business plan. But it's just indicative of just the changing marketplace that we live in. The diversity of ideas, clearly we're in a market where demographics, technology, hyperconnectivity, and deregulation are clearly disrupting the value chain. And then the one that's probably closest to my heart is clearly the diversity of talent. By 2030, China will have more graduates than the entire US workforce. And India will produce 4 times as many graduates as the US by 2020. And not to forget the millennials, they too are coming of age, and that generation will comprise 50% of the global workforce within the next 2 years. So it's clearly times are changing. So the issue of inclusion and why it's important to business is there, but as leaders, it presents a host of challenges around the world. So before we start, we're going to give you your first test of your global knowledge. And Gemma, I guess you have the poll.
Yeah, Frank, I'm just going to launch it now. Hopefully that's popping up on people's screens.
All right, so there's your question. And if you can just click on the screen there as to what you believe the right answer is.
Lots of timid voters, Frank.
Say it again.
There's some timid voters on here. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now.
Okay. Very good. Very good. And indeed, it is Hindu. Absolutely right there. So we don't have a lot of time, and clearly managing and global leadership and the capabilities and the competencies, that's a 1 day, that's a 1 week, and in some universities that's a course of study unto itself. So we're going to try to, I'm going to try to touch on just some key highlights across the world as we see it. And clearly one of the issues about inclusive relationships and inclusive leaders and management is that every country has its own norms, its own cultures, its own sense of hierarchy, its own sense of personal and professional territories. So, clearly, if you've ever had the misfortune of sitting next to an American on a 7-hour flight, you'll know immediately the differences in the culture, because within 2 hours of that flight, your American neighbor on your flight will have told you about their ex-wife, bleeding them blind with alimony payments. They've told you about the 2 kids and probably the school fees of $100,000. They're not going to do it. Their 401ks is drowning them. It's all different, and clearly that's part of the challenge. And what I'm going to just highlight is different aspects as we go to 3 different stops along this presentation that will impact you from a leader, human resource, and business point of view. And so, the first one is Kentucky Fried Chicken. which is interesting. You know, if you wish, respectfully, here we order out for Chinese, and in China, you know, one of the fastest and the biggest fast food American restaurant there is fried chicken, and it's not necessarily as we would know it here. They have tailored the local market in terms of things we would not see in the UK or the USA, like egg tarts and shrimp burgers and dough sticks, for example. And in 2016, they are twice the size of McDonald's in that market. Now, not just related to Kentucky Fried Chicken, but anyone who goes into China will find that they are dealing with a different perspective of leadership there. It's very much a society around Confucius. I would say if anyone is going to China or going to work in China, understanding and reading Confucian literature is very key. But some of the things that I would point out when you're looking at China from a leadership point of view, from an inclusion point of view, how you manage in that environment. One of the things that jump out to me is the issue of face and face saving. And we will come back to that in one of the other stops we make. But face has a much deeper meaning in China than in the West. Many Chinese will go to great lengths either to save face or to save someone else's face. And so face is about dignity and respect, and it's about a person's social role. It's not about feelings per se. There's a saying that a person would rather die than lose face. And so here, you know, we have Western terms such as in your face, if you wish. And we have a very Western perspective in terms of being direct and to the point. And you wouldn't dress someone down in China as you might dress them down possibly in the US or even in the UK. But one of the key issues there is about face. And so in terms of being inclusive and understanding, managing those relationships, saving face is very important. So in embarrassing an employee or in any way showing them any sort of disrespect will cause great tension in that culture. The Confucian concept of harmony is still important today. The Chinese sometimes perceive Western independence as a sign of showing off. And so many of our leadership competencies that we have here in the West and in HR in particular tends to be, and many times around alpha behaviors, I would call it, in terms of standing out from the crowd, in terms of self-promotion, aggressiveness. And there, you know, the issue of harmony is very significant. And so our sense of what a leader looks like and how leaders behave in terms of, you know, their presence and putting themselves forward. Again, if you were to apply those standards in China, it would backfire. What's interesting about China is that it's also a very hierarchical society, yet decision-making is very consensual. And so there's a respect for hierarchy, there's a respect for role, but decision-making tends to be very very consensual, and indeed it tends to take longer. You know, here in the West, we tend to believe in the value of making quick decisions and then moving to action. You know, our saying, you know, time is money. If you were to practice that concept in China, it's likely to backfire. The Chinese typically want to be sure that all angles of an issue are reviewed first and all matters are thought through before coming to a conclusion. So as we will see as we go through this journey very quickly, the key point here in terms of inclusive leadership is that it doesn't work everywhere, which, you know, many of you already know, but it has particular dimensions in the particular country and culture you're working in. And also communications. Communications tend to be indirect and focused on building relationships. And I know coming just from the US, quite honestly, when I came to London 20 years ago, where we tend to be in your face in the US, it tends to be what I would call intellectual combat in meetings. I found the British business culture much more consensual, much more metaphorical. A decision tended to be the start of the discussion. And indeed, it goes even to the other side when you're dealing in China and other Asian countries, that communications tends to be indirect. For the Chinese, communications are about building relationships, while on the rest, it tends to be about an efficient exchange of information. Indeed, and the Confucian belief is that, is sometimes you're expected to listen and silence. So it's not always about necessarily direct participation, getting your share of the time. The issue of lean in, for example, among male and females would be somewhat distant in some ways. So the point there is, as we start in Asia, is again that inclusiveness it differs from where you are, and it's important as leaders. Goes without saying that you truly understand some of the nuances of what's going to be required to be inclusive. So asking someone in the room, in the meeting, to speak out or debate with you, as you might try to do, and pulling all the voices, may not work exactly the same way in the Asian context. The implications for that is a couple of things. There is that, one of the things we tend to value in our leadership competencies and many organizations, and every CEO these days talks about taking risk and such. Taking risk is not something that would translate very well in a competency framework if you're applying that potentially to the Asian and Chinese staff. The issue of the leadership statue, again, some of those alpha behaviors, as I would call them, that is underlying many of our leadership competencies and values, would not necessarily stand out there. And indeed, understanding and navigating the organization, that politicalness that we also assume of part of our Western competencies of managing up and across and politics, if you wish, with the small p. I would warn you that those things will not necessarily yield you the best understanding of your Chinese staff and organization. If we move towards the West, we have another poll for you. So, which languages are spoken in Nigeria?
How do you pronounce these, Frank?
Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo, and Fulani.
Thank you. We're sitting at 65% voted.
Okay.
Slight hesitancy on this one. It's a tricky one. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share results.
Okay. Okay, all the above is the correct answer. Indeed, I think there's about 120 different languages in Nigeria. So we've looked a little bit at the Asian context, and indeed, as you will see, it is going to be slightly different and slightly similar in some ways in the African context. The business environment in many African countries, and it's interesting because that business environment, as we'll see in the next slide, actually translates into many of the competencies that African leaders have that may not necessarily be the same competencies of our Western leaders. But if you've ever been to sub-Saharan Africa, and if I just stick with Nigeria, for example, you'll know that the business environment for many African countries are things that we just take for granted in the West. So getting electricity is one of the the most important issues for businesses in Nigeria. Getting construction permits, the infrastructure of traveling. It can take you a 5-mile trip can take you anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours if it's raining. And another key challenge for many businesses in Africa is actually keeping some of the talent in the country, some of the top talent, to stop some of the top talent from moving to the UK or the US or even in Canada. Nigeria is the largest country in Africa. It's one of the fastest growing. Clearly, oil is still a key part of it. If we look at leadership and culture traits in West Africa, as always, when you're making statements about culture and leadership, you're making generalizations, but I think most studies would point to these being some of the key. The leadership structure, very male dominated. Clearly, it's changing, but it would still be a very male-dominated structure. The leadership style tends to be participatory, but you will find exceptions of autocracy, very much a command and control environment in some places. And when you're looking at the traditional, again, leadership competencies of the West, of building a shared vision and things of that sort, you may find that your African leaders actually don't score as high on some of those because of sometimes the remnants of a command and control environment. The other key thing I would say in terms of the culture in general is that your influences may not be on the organizational chart. And I think this is a very key one in terms of leadership in a global environment, is that we tend to look at the top chart, the leaders -1, leaders -2, and think those are the key influencers. But because of the society, the respect for hierarchy, the respect for status, the respect for age, and also because of tribal influences, that's part of the culture there. Your key influencer may not show up anywhere on your organizational chart. And I know from the work I did there, I was working for one of the major oil companies, we found that we had to rethink totally our way of engaging and stakeholder influence there. So I had a head of human resources for the Africa region who sat in Lagos. He happened to be a tribal chief, and so he was referenced at meetings as chief. And so I'm there with my particular point of view, and he's there with his particular point of view. And whenever they spoke to me, it was Frank, and whenever they spoke to him, it was Chief. And so you can imagine the dynamics that took place, which was there was very little debate within that meeting with Chief. And Chief was not necessarily, and he wasn't the only tribal chief in the organization, but the point is that you don't necessarily see them on the organization chart and don't really understand that the engagement process is just going to be totally different. The respect for hierarchy comes with that. And again, the sense of respect and face is very much part of many of the African cultures. I will touch on just also the beneath the surface biases that are not obvious necessarily from the Western point of view, because in Nigeria in particular, very much a tribal culture. And so intertribal biases exist there. And the other key issue there is the local skill development is very important for anyone in terms of their license to operate. The issue that comes up in Asia and Africa in particular, as we look at our Western, and again, my contrast here is really the Western view, is one of the things we look for in our leaders sometimes is this sense of edge. We expect our leaders to always be pushing, to always be driving, to be aggressive. And it's just that concept of edge, which is talked about and used quite a bit. Edge is not going to show itself in our Western view in the Asian environment very well, and here the sense of edge may show itself not in our way we may want it. It may show itself more in terms of a command and control, and so the challenges you will have there in terms of being inclusive. And understanding that culture is going to be very complex because there's going to be a lot of beneath the surface biases. There's going to be the sense that you may not get all the input you want online. You may have to take things offline. And then even more so, the sense of your influencers won't be on the organization chart. And then that deference to hierarchy. Also makes the sense of how do we get everyone's voice in here and make sure we're getting the right opinion, as opposed to are people staying quiet because they're not willing to challenge and put a different viewpoint on than their boss or a more status individual in that environment. And so one of the issues, therefore, in terms of being inclusive there is that, in terms of how do we manage change in West Africa and in that global context. And a couple of things I would say is that you need to engage early and often. It needs to be explained, why we're doing this and what are the options, because many decisions there impact not just the workforce, but they also impact the community. I would also say, while inclusion would involve, getting everyone in that voice in the room, the decisions must be locally owned. If those decisions are from the headquarters in London or The Hague or Paris, you will be challenged. And I would say the most important thing in managing in the global context, in this case in West Africa, is do not focus on hierarchy and organization chart for your influencers. It's not going to be that easy. And then if we come a little closer to home, we have one more poll there.
Hi, Frank. In the interest of time, I might recommend that we jump this poll, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
But if I may, I have had an interesting question come in.
Okay.
Given the context that today is International Women's Day.
Yes.
What differences do you see between men and women's ability to navigate these different global cultures successfully?
Yeah, I think that's another webinar unto itself. I would so it's contrary to what today's day is about, but it's a real life example. So when I was with Shell, we were rolling out a global diversity and inclusion program, and this would have been about 16 years ago. I was there when we rolled it out in Malaysia. We were speaking to the issue of treating everyone equal and such. And indeed, one of our female staff raised her hand and said, I don't want to be treated equal to my husband. He is the breadwinner, and I want him to be the one, in charge of the household and earning the living. And that kind of took us aback. clearly it's not an issue of all women are equal. That's not the point. But the issue of in this day and age where women are in the different societies, be it Saudi Arabia versus London, if you wish, or other parts of the Middle East, one has to be sensitive to the local context, and one always has to avoid overlaying necessarily a Western perspective into non-Western environments. So the short answer is you have to always look at these things in the local context of how do you impact that change and how that journey is taking place. So there's no, as you know, as this whistle stop presentation hopefully will show, is there's no one size fits all, and the worst mistake you can ever make as a leader is trying to overlay a Western perspective in non-Western societies. And so the issue of women in society is not a debatable issue, but how do you address it and how do you deal with it has to be very sensitive to the local context.
Thank you. David, I hope that answers your question. And Frank, maybe there's another webinar that we can do together.
Yes. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to pass back over to you, and you also asked me to keep you on top of timing.
Yes,
just to let you know, it's 1:30 now. Okay. Thank you.
And then if I bring this topic closer to home, International Women's Day, and the issue of diversity and inclusion is clearly is on the top of the agenda, from gender pay to ethnic pay gap to all the conversations that have been around it. Let me just say this, because I mean I have a dog in this fight because we are a consulting firm. But my viewpoint is, for most of you who, in spite of your best intentions, my viewpoint is that most D&I initiatives in the UK, as they're constituted currently, will fail. That's the good news. Why, you say? Well, partly is because many of the D&I and inclusion initiatives, and let's separate diversity from inclusion and focus mostly on inclusion, because diversity, everyone has increased their feeder pool. They have a diverse population, most likely at the junior level. The challenge is, how is it an inclusive environment that's going to retain and progress and leverage those capabilities? Why will most of the D&I initiatives, as they're currently structured, fail? One is because many of them do not involve the leadership of the organization. Many of them, be it flexible working, be it paternity policies, it's kind of done outside of the C-suite. Can we put in a new unbiased training program? And the C-suite says yes, and then they go to the next agenda item. The challenge in inclusion and culture change is that it has to also involve and ultimately challenge the leadership norms and behaviors of the organization. Most of the programs in place are programs, but they don't involve and they don't challenge the leadership behaviors and the norms. They stay away from that because that's a difficult conversation. It could be a career limiting conversation to tell your bosses, you're the problem. It's not the flexible working program per se. You're the problem. It's the interactions that you have with staff. It's your behaviors. It's how you exhibit possibly privilege. The culture of every organization is different. The HR processes and the practices are different, and how they impact the people in reality. And ultimately, the lived experiences of what it's like to walk through the door at 9 o'clock in company A versus walk through the door at 9 o'clock in company B, and what happens between then and the next 8 to 10 hours are uniquely different. All four of those are unique to each organization. However, most organizations are just using off-the-shelf solutions. They're not tailored to their specific issues. And so, in my mind, if D&I was a suit, this is how it would look. We really are just taking in my mind, the low-hanging fruit. We're ticking the box, we're putting programs in place, and we haven't done the hard work of understanding exactly how it pertains to us. What are our leadership challenges? What do our leaders do? What do our leaders say? What don't they say? And I'll get into that a little bit. And so, as we've seen with the gender pay gap reporting, most companies reported last year. And what we're finding now is that many of them, it hasn't changed, or in fact, in some cases, it's gotten worse. And I would tell you that the reason why it's gotten worse is that first bullet there, is that very few organizations are challenging the leadership behaviors of the organization. So in the time we have, some of the inclusion's knots. So as we look as to why they're going to fail, here's some of the things we do that cause them to fail. And so I've heard this so many times as I work with companies and listen to the experience of others, is that many companies will assume that they're a meritocracy, and you'll find the CEO or maybe even the senior HR person say, we only hire the best person for the job. Well, okay, that's fine. We can talk about that at another point. But the most important thing about that is the impact it has to a listener. If you are a underrepresented group in your organization, and your CEO kind of says, we only hire the best person for the job, what they are most likely hearing is your CEO saying, we believe there's a trade-off between talent and diversity. They're saying it's a zero-sum game, basically. That's how it's being heard. Do not say, we only hire the best person for the job, because you're telling people that you think you're not going to make a trade-off by hiring diverse managers or individuals. The others don't speak to diversity, because everyone likes to say, we have diversity initiatives. Don't speak to diversity if you're only championing female representation. Nothing wrong with female representation, but that's not diversity. Diversity is really looking at all those groups that aren't part of your dominant culture. And the typical dominant culture in most organizations is white, heterosexual, able-bodied male. Unless you're dealing with, if you wish, all the deviations from any of those four, you're not talking about diversity. So be very careful when you talk about diversity, because you have other people in the organization who are not female and who are not white female, and they're being left behind, and they will hear that as a neglect for their issues. And clearly that's the third bullet there. Do not exclude race, age, disability, LGBT from your D&I strategies. And most companies have focused on gender. I've had clients that I've spoken to, and they said, no, we're just focusing on gender right now. And so that inability of leaders and the HR function to walk and chew gum at the same time is a challenge. And because of time, so don't run away from the race conversation. We've done a lot of work in that area. That's probably one of the hardest areas we work in. Race, as we've seen in the last week in the news here, it's a difficult conversation in the country, and it's even more of a difficult conversation in the corporate sector. We tell people, I know it sounds kind of in your face, but we say, every white executive, every white male executive knows a white female. And that's when you say that women are part of the typical C-suite professional orbit, and women are part of the C-suite personal orbit. Very few C-suite people have ethnic minorities in the professional orbit or their personal orbit, and that distance and lack of understanding creates a difficulty in there. The other do not. Do not base your family-friendly policies only on women with children. Not every woman has a child. Not every woman is married. But if you look at what most female-friendly policies and family-friendly policies are triggered on, they're triggered around women. And so we look at women as a rather monolithic issue. and you may be losing female talent in your organization, so you put in another flexible working, or you look at maternity leave, or returning moms as maybe a new policy you have. Don't assume all women are married with children and those are their issues. There are many women who are neither of those. BAME is not monolithic. Hindus, Muslim, blacks are all different, and that creates a difficulty, but don't necessarily lump everyone and assume that it's all the same and the issues are the same. The BAME diversity issue is different from women for things I've just talked about. The most basic one is that most female issues are much more comfortable to discuss in general. There's a host of other issues. And just the term intersectionality is a term that the academics use a lot, but it's a real sense. And so I would say that when you're looking at inclusion, at the most basic definition, I say you need to also be aware of is the intersection of sexism and racism in that. What to do, as I know the clock is ticking here. You need to make sure you align your narrative to D&I, to your business strategy. What is it that D&I does for us? We're a widget maker. D&I helps us as a widget maker move into new markets. It helps us to exploit the needs of different communities. It's going to help us understand how our widgets are used in emerging markets. You need to make sure your D&I is not just a nice to have sort of narrative on your website that is good for society and things, but it needs to be about what is it about D&I that drives your business. Challenge the underlying assumptions of your HR policies. For example, you all probably have gone through your succession planning. You may have a 6 or 9 box grid there. I would probably have taken a poll and said that 85% of you, because I've been there, would probably not consider anyone over the age of 45, give or take, as high potential. And in a world where we're looking at 100-year life, it is no longer a career for life, but it's going to be a life of careers. We have built-in biases within some of our processes that exclude rather than include. And ageism is one of the ones that we don't talk about a lot, but ageism is built in to many of our processes. If you're talking about D&I, don't talk about it scripted, talk about it from the heart. Stay curious, not defensive. You need to align your performance management and your reward policies to D&I. If it's just sitting out there as, I have the business to do from 9 to 6, and if I have some extra time, I'll focus on people and inclusion, it's not going to work. And indeed, not just me, but enough studies that to really understand your employees, you really need to understand their lived experiences. And part of that lived experiences will be about their perspective on the leadership and the leadership behavior. I would strongly suggest that you do not try to undertake that sort of focus group work, qualitative work internally. You'll not get the sort of results that are true to life, and indeed, even if you did get them, you may find them career limiting, and therefore very reluctant to share them back up the organization. So, in terms of inclusive leadership in a global context, there's a lot of things that probably go into being an inclusive leader, but for me, these are the most, I say the 4 most important. One is the sense of empathy, intellectual curiosity. For me, the most important of all of those is the ability to unlearn. You cannot go into Africa, Asia, Middle East, South America. You cannot go in and just assume the Western and the traditional approach. It's the ability to unlearn, I think, which is the most important thing for inclusive leadership in a global context. You have to challenge and be hesitant to assume that your way is the only way. And a key part of that is, for an inclusive leader, that you always put yourself in the position of questioning versus asserting. I I think I'm right at the 45 minutes, Jimmer. Happy to take any questions if we can. A couple of minutes. I did run through that very quickly.
I think we can give you a couple of extra minutes,
okay.
Frank, if everyone's happy to stay on the line.
Okay.
I'd like to kick off the questions myself with one, if that's okay. So on our runway program, we have a lot of leaders who are aspiring towards those executive level roles or even the CEO role. And one of the requirements from a lot of their organizations is that they must have international experience.
Yes.
And that, to be well-rounded leaders, they need to spend some time abroad. So what kind of advice would you give to perhaps British expats who are going abroad, they're going to take on an international role, and how can organizations help prepare them for that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Gemma. I would roll it back even before that. I would say that every organization, before they send an expat anywhere, they should have an internal criteria to assess the capability of that manager to work in another environment. So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, but has that individual in their current job exhibited cultural sensitivity? So if they're in London, which is a multi-generational, multicultural environment and workforce, have they already exhibited the cultural sensitivity in their current role? If they haven't exhibited in their current role, sending them overseas to develop it, it's not going to work. So I think part of what has not really happened in most corporations is they haven't assessed the ability of the manager to work in another culture. So I think that's more the starting point as opposed to what the manager needs to do. I think they need to exhibit many of those traits before they're considered for an expat situation. And then I think it's the issue of unlearning. You really have to go in and not assume you're coming in guns a-blazing with all the answers to the questions. You really need to immerse yourself in that culture. But I would say the biggest shortcoming typically is not the individual, is that the wrong individual possibly has been selected for that assignment.
Thank you. I really like that point around the ability to unlearn. I was interviewing an ex-Royal Marine who spent some time advising the Ministry of the Interior and Afghan National Police. And for him, it was about, basically, it was this concept of unlearning, and it was learning to listen and basically ignore all of the assumptions that he'd gone into that role with. Really interesting conversation. I've got another question here, which is, where have you seen D&I initiatives or I&D work really well?
Well, other than my clients,
of course.
yes. I hate to say I haven't seen it work that well yet, because again, I think we're still at a stage where we are ticking the boxes. So the civil service, the NHS, they've been at this much longer than most PLC organizations. It's been part of their priorities for the last 10 to 15 years. And if you read the papers and the literature on where the NHS is or where the civil service is, they're still struggling. And so there's very few companies that are attacking it, because unfortunately, you have to change the leaders. And who is in a role in the organization, unless the CEO, is really behind it, who's going to go to the C-suite and say, you're the reason why we're losing people. You're the reason why we're not being able to recruit the best and the brightest. That's the missing link in most of the D&I initiatives, is that people are putting in programs for the masses, and they're not focusing on the critical few who actually make a difference in the culture of the organization. So leaders cast a shadow over the organization. And most D&I initiatives are not dealing with that shadow, if you wish.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions. I'm going to ask one of them, okay, just in the interest of time.
Okay.
Given the existence of local patriarchal-based cultures in, for example, West Africa, how does one challenge such cultures but show respect for them in the context of aspiring towards global D&I from a Western European perspective? Or do we just have to accept the differences and in the round hope for sufficient D&I across the business as a whole?
Well, I think first off, you have to accept the differences because there is no such thing as a global D&I policy. Because, you know, D&I in the US, you know, I mean, protected groups in the US is anyone over age 45, for example. So, you know, every D&I policy in the US is dealing with protected groups of over 45 women, Latinos, Hispanics, and Black Americans and Native Indians. That doesn't translate here. Over 45 is not a protected trait here. Many of these countries, there are no discrimination laws based on age. There is no discrimination. There's no laws against discrimination based on sexual orientation. I believe in any part of Africa or Asia. So you're starting out from a different base. It's not against the law to fire someone because of sexual orientation. It's not against the law to fire someone because of age in many of these countries. And indeed, in some of these countries, it's not against the law to discriminate against women in the job market. So you have to define it locally. And so the short answer is D&I is about defining in any culture what the dominant culture is. And so you go into that country, say, you know, the dominant culture is, you know, maybe it's Chinese and male, and therefore here D&I might be about Malaysians, it may be about Indians. In Germany, D&I may be about Turkish staff. France doesn't even talk about race as part of its culture. So there is, you'll stumble if you try to have a D&I program. You really need to define in each location the dominant corporate culture, and then from that define the underrepresented cultures there. In Africa, in Nigeria, it's a very difficult one because the dominant culture may be tribal. And so there may be certain tribes that have been excluded from the senior leadership organization. These are very sensitive issues. They're sometimes life and death issues. But your diagnostic has to start with, in whatever area you're talking about, what's the dominant culture and then what's the underrepresented culture?
Thank you, Frank. And thank you very much for that question. Frank, can I invite you to progress the slides forward to the final slide, which has our contact details on it?
Yes.
Thank you. And Frank has very kindly offered to accept any questions that anyone may have for him. So you can see his email address on the slide there, as well as mine if you have any questions about the work we do at School for CEOs. I'll be sending out a link to the recording to everyone. And Frank, if that's okay, I'll also drop in your contact details into that as well.
Thank you. Follow me on Twitter. I can increase my billing rates if I get more followers, is my belief.
Oh, there you go.
Yes.
Help them out.
Yes.
Frank, just a really big thank you from me. It's been really insightful. I've learned a lot through the last 50 minutes or so.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for staying on the line. Apologies we overran slightly, but I didn't want to break Frank in his flow. There's so much gold coming out of his mouth. Yeah. So thank you very much to everyone. Have a fantastic weekend, and we'll be following up early next week. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.